example, the whole question of cow sacrifice, which I talk about in chapter 4 of my book, whereby for one group of Muslim scholars associated with the Khilafat movement, such as Abul Kalam Azad, Maulvi Abdul Bari of the Farangi Mahal school, the rationalist Farangi Mahal school, who was very close, of course, to Congress and to Gandhi, they argue that, since cow sacrifice is not an obligation in Islam, in Islamic law, on the occasion of Eid, you could sacrifice any of the other prescribed animals like goats, sheep, etc. And even in terms of everyday life, you do not have to insist on the sacrifice of cows, and that's what one should do. Sort of not completely cease, but reduce cow sacrifice to the extent possible, due to respecting the sensitivities of the Hindu community. How that becomes significant and critical for a contemporary actor like Sharjeel Imam is, I think, quite fascinating. Whether we agree with him or we don't. And the last point I would make on Sharjeel Imam and this question is that, even if you might not fully agree with him, I think he is onto something about the whole question of, why in Western context and even in South Asian context, we are so oftentimes invested in finding what one might call the good Muslims from history. Even someone like Abul Kalam Azad is much more complicated than some kind of a, inclusivist or a good liberal Muslim, because this was the scholar who in fact said that waging jihad and waging a war against the British state was an individual obligation on every Indian Muslim.
Welcome to another immersive episode of Dariyaa, your go-to podcast for deep dives into captivating world of politics, culture, society, and policy. In this episode, Srushti and I, hosts of Dariyaa, are in conversation with Dr. SherAli Tareen, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall, discussing his groundbreaking new work on the complex intra-Muslim debates surrounding Hindu-Muslim friendship and political theology in South Asia during 18th to 20th century. Dr. SherAli Tareen argues that the loss of Muslim political sovereignty under colonialism led to heightened emphasis on embodied practices and markers of distinction as a means of asserting Muslim identity and supremacy. He explores how scholars of diverse ideological persuasions engaged with Islamic legal tradition and colonial modernity to articulate competing visions of Islam and interreligious relations. Through a close reading of fascinating historical figures and text, Dr. Tareen reveals nuanced logic and internal contestations that shaped Muslims and their thought during the transformative period. He challenges simplistic binaries of good and bad Muslims, calling for a deeper, more empathetic engagement with voices that defy modern liberal categories. Welcome to another immersive episode of Dariyaa, your go-to podcast for deep dive into captivating world of politics, culture, society, and policy. In this episode, I, your host Omer, and my co-host Srushti, we are in conversation with Dr. SherAli Tareen, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. We are discussing his groundbreaking new book on the complex intra-Muslim debate surrounding Hindu-Muslim friendship and political theology in South Asia during 18th to 20th century. Dr. Tareen argues that the loss of Muslim political sovereignty under colonialism led to a heightened emphasis on embodied practice and markers of distinction as a means of asserting Muslim identity and supremacy. He explores how Muslim scholars of diverse ideological persuasions engaged with the Islamic legal tradition and colonial modernity, trying to articulate competing visions of Islam and inter-religious relationships. Through a very close reading of very fascinating historical figures and text, Dr. Tareen reveals nuanced logic and internal contestations that shaped Muslim thought during these transformative periods. He challenges the simplistic binary of good and bad Muslims and he calls for a deeper, more empathetic engagement with the voices that defy modern liberal categories. At a time of rising Islamophobia and Hindu nationalism in South Asia, Dr. Tareen shows how these historical debates over boundaries of friendship and cultural exchange continue to resonate powerfully with contemporary controversies, from vigilantism to the Citizenship Amendment Act in India. For anyone seeking a more nuanced understanding of the role of Islam in South Asian history and politics, this episode offers a wealth of insight and provocations. Join us for a stimulating exploration of sovereignty, translation, tradition, and unexpected afterlives of colonial era Muslim thought. So I think we'll start with the general question. If you could tell us a bit about yourself, a brief introduction, and then followed up by what the book Perilous Intimacies is all about.
Sure. Thank you both Srushti and Omer for inviting me again to your excellent podcast series. As I've always said that for me, my audience in India, Pakistan, and Kashmir are the most important audiences. So it's always great to be able to connect with those audiences. So, I've been on your podcast before in relation to my first book. Just to very briefly introduce myself, I teach Islam and religion at Franklin and Marshall College here in the US, where I've been teaching for a dozen years now. And before that, I did my PhD at Duke University in religious studies. And originally, I from Quetta in Pakistan, but I've been in the US now for the last 23 years or so. And my main sort of objective of my research has been to try to present the details, the complexities, the ambiguities of Muslim scholarly traditions of debate and contestation, and their discourses more broadly on crucial questions of law, ethics, theology in early modern and modern South Asia, primarily from the 18th to the 20th centuries. And in this book, which is my second book, I'm primarily looking at intra-Muslim scholarly debates and contestations on the specific theme of Hindu-Muslim friendship and interreligious friendship, interreligious relations more broadly speaking, where again my objective is to use this as a case study, Muslim intellectual discourses and debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship, to examine and bring into view larger points of complexities and also ways in which this particular topic, this particular theme of debates over interreligious friendship becomes the grounds for competing articulations of Islam in the conditions of colonial modernity. So, just one second. Your stuff is the main desk, the front desk. Thank you. In this book, the time period is from the mid 18th century to the mid 20th century, and I look at this theme of Hindu-Muslim friendship through a number of different themes, discursive, political, ethical themes, including Muslim scholarly translations of Hinduism, interreligious theological debates and polemics, debates on the question of the normative relationship between Muslims, Hindus, and the British in the context of colonial India, debates on cow sacrifice and slaughter, and then debates on imitating the customs and practices of non-Muslims. So those are sort of 6 chapters that are thematically structured, and then the book ends with some examples from contemporary India and contemporary Pakistan in terms of this whole question. And my main argument in this book is basically twofold. My first main argument is that as we see the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in South Asia from the late 18th century onwards, these debates on the limits of the normative boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship becomes the grounds for the articulation of competing notions of sovereign power in the absence of political sovereignty. So regardless of what kind of an opinion individual Muslim scholars might have held, whether that was more permissive or more encouraging towards Hindu-Muslim friendship or more prohibitive, at stake in these competing views were competing notions of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. And connected to that, a central argument is that with the resurrection of a Muslim state no longer a viable possibility, it is the practice of everyday ritual life that becomes the stage, or that becomes the main theater for the articulation and preservation of Muslim sovereign power by maintaining Muslim distinction over the non-Muslim other. That becomes one of the main arenas for conceptions of Muslim sovereign power. And the second main argument of the book is that we cannot reduce these intra-Muslim debates to conventional or popular binaries or stereotypes like inclusivists or exclusivists or liberals and fundamentalists or moderates and extremists, but rather the logics and complexities of these intra-Muslim debates render untenable the presumption of these kinds of contemporary binaries when we approach this topic of intra-Muslim debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship.
Fab. I think in this conversation, we'll be focusing a lot more on your first fold of the argument primarily, and probably touch upon the second fold of the argument. But when you're speaking of sovereignty, while I was reading your book, I was it took me by surprise about how sovereignty can be conceived of, and I think on that note, if you could just touch upon briefly what are the different kinds of conversations happening in and around
Yep.
the conception of sovereignty, as
Right.
well as what does sovereignty begin to look like for Muslims
Sure.
with the fall of Muslim sovereignty as you define. Yeah.
Sure. Sovereignty is a category that is really important and fascinating, but also very difficult to grapple with and very difficult to theorize or define for that matter, because what it means and its definitions have kept on evolving over time. Even in Western thought, even in Western philosophy, where, as I talk about in my introduction, that even in Western Christian thought, sovereignty undergoes, this concept of sovereignty undergoes a critical shift between the sovereign God being understood as the central sort of fulcrum or the central site of divine goodness, divine mercy, takes on a meaning which is connected to the capacity, the possibility of announcing the exception, which in theological terms is a miracle, basically. The sovereign is the entity who can announce, who can enact the exception, which then gets taken up even by the modern state, because basically it's the suspension of a constitution, the suspension of laws, the declaration of an emergency, or the exception to the norm becomes the central sort of marker of modern state sovereignty, as well as was most systematically elucidated by the German theorist and lawyer Carl Schmitt in his famous 1922 publication, Political Theology, among his other publications. In this book, when I talk about the idea of sovereignty, I am not so much interested in the institutional exercise of sovereignty by the modern state.
Mm-hmm.
I am rather interested in notions of sovereign power that are connected to the desire on the part of a religious community to establish its theological and hence political superiority over the religious other through the maintenance of distinction in the public sphere, in the practice of everyday life. So it's not so much the notion of sovereign power that I am interested in is not so much connected to the institutional capacities of the modern state, but rather in the capacity to regulate the choreography of everyday life, the kind of the spatiality of the public sphere in a way that is invested in maintaining and preserving and asserting the distinction of the self over the other in a very sort of palpable and observable fashion. In my own book, just to sort of elaborate on this concept, sometimes it's useful to just share something that I've put in writing about this idea of sovereignty. So this I'm reading from page 11 of the book, where I basically say what I was saying just now, but maybe in a slightly clearer fashion. It says that um, uh, what interests me is in notion of sovereignty and sovereign power that animates and is animated by the desire for an attachment to supremacy over the religious other through the maintenance of embodied distinction in everyday life. Such a concept of sovereignty is focused less on the expenditure of power for the governance of citizens, which is the modern state sovereignty. But this notion of sovereign power that I'm interested in is focused more on governing those hierarchies of difference that nourish the fantasy of distinction and supremacy over the other. So I'm really, interested in this concept of sovereignty from the perspective of interrogating the question of, as the resurrection of a Muslim state becomes an impossibility, what are some of the new imaginaries and possibilities of politics that become visible in South Asian Islam, in South Asian Muslim intellectual thought, and this kind of a notion of the political, which is invested in the regulation of everyday life, which is invested in practices like cow sacrifice, or the distance or the spatial geography of the relationship of mosques and temples in terms of the kind of spatiality and choreography of everyday life in terms of maintaining that distinction between the self and the other. So this kind of a notion of politics and sovereignty um, is not connected to the machineries of liberal democracy, or the machineries or processes of electoral democracy, what we usually associate with the word politics. But it's a notion of politics which is invested in the ethical formation of the self, the practice of everyday ritual life, which interestingly and somewhat paradoxically, that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, this kind of a notion of sovereign power, in fact, is a lot more capacious than the notion of modern state sovereignty, because this notion of sovereign power is not tethered, is not inextricably entangled with the modern state. So, to complete my response to your question, Omar, uh, in this book, although the Arabic, Persian, Urdu categories corresponding to such a notion of sovereign power are multiple, including ideas like superiority or isti'la, or to this idea of majesty or shauka, or uh, dominance, haiba, iqtidar, khilafa. All of these different categories come up in the book. But when I use the word sovereignty, I'm not referring to any one particular category in Arabic, in Persian, or in Urdu, the three languages that I work with in this book, but rather these concepts and these categories coming together as a family of concepts to index the notion of maintaining the politico-theological superiority over the religious other through the maintenance of embodied distinction in everyday ritual life, through the preservation of this very key category in the book, which is called through the preservation of uh, markers of Muslim distinction, what in Arabic or Urdu we call sha'air Islam, which is the plural singular is shi'ar Islam, meaning the distinctive markers of Islam. So how those distinctive markers of Islam in everyday ritual life becomes the primary theater and site for uh, uh, the location and then the maintenance of sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty.
Yeah, Srushti, gone.
Yes, Dr. Tareen, so when it comes to everyday life and rituals, I had a couple of questions on the same line of thought. So the sovereignty is normative in nature since it appears in, discourses from in theological discourses. And you have also acknowledged in your book that the execution of it might vary depending on a range of factors. So do you maybe want to elaborate on, what are the factors governing the diverse execution of this sovereignty along the course of the Indian subcontinent? And also, like, just for the ease of the conversation, if you can give us some examples of how Muslim distinction was practiced.
Thank you. Great question, Srushti. I'll say two things in response to your question. The first thing I would say is that this whole idea of sovereign power that I just described and delineated in my last response, um, it's not some kind of a grand theoretical model that I'm arguing applies to each and every South Asian Muslim thinker in the early modern or modern period. There were Muslim scholars, for example, those associated with the Khilafat movement that have a lot of coverage in this book, especially in chapters 3 and 4, who tried to pressure the British colonial government into preserving the territorial and spiritual, the territorial boundaries and the spiritual stature of the Ottoman state, which for them was the Ottoman Caliphate. So to them, it was not so much the preservation of embodied ritual practices, but rather the institution of the caliphate, where sovereign power resided. In fact, for many scholars associated with the Khilafat movement, such as perhaps the most famous scholar attached to it, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, died 1958. I mean, he even went on to argue that in the absence of the caliphate, even ritual practices the obligations of religion, such as praying, fasting, etc., would have no legitimacy. That even the obligations of religion only derive their legitimacy from the existence of the institution of the caliphate, which is a very radical statement to make. It has some precedent, but nonetheless, it is a pretty radical statement to make. So for him, sovereign power meant something else. So it's not some kind of a grand theoretical model that applies to each and every thinker. Second thing that I would say in terms of examples. So, some great examples, or illustrative, I should rather say, are, for example, the whole question of cow sacrifice, which I talk about in chapter 4 of my book, whereby for one group of Muslim scholars associated with the Khilafat movement, such as Abul Kalam Azad, Maulvi Abdul Bari of the Farangi Mahal school, the rationalist Farangi Mahal school, who was very close, of course, to Congress and to Gandhi, they argue that, since cow sacrifice is not an obligation in Islam, in Islamic law, on the occasion of Eid, uh, you could sacrifice any of the other prescribed animals like goats, sheep, etc. And even in terms of everyday life, you do not have to insist on the sacrifice of cows, and that's what one should do. Sort of not completely cease, but reduce cow sacrifice to the extent possible, due to respecting the sensitivities of the Hindu community, and because of that, you will be able to forge a friendship with the Hindu community and build an alliance with which you can then oppose the British colonial government much more effectively. So that was one kind of argument to do with cow sacrifice. But the opposing argument on this question, those who opposed the Khilafat movement leaders, one of the most vociferous and most influential voices in that regard was the founder of the school of thought called the Barelvi school in Islam, in South Asian Islam especially, named after the town from which the founder of the school, Ahmad Raza Khan, was from, Bareilly. Ahmad Raza Khan died in 1921. And Ahmad Raza Khan's argument was that this practice of cow sacrifice is a marker of Muslim distinction, is among the sha'air, or the markers of Muslim distinction in the context of South Asia. So even though this practice, according to Islamic law, is what is called simply permissible, meaning neither obligatory nor forbidden, just simply permissible. It's a sort of a category in Islamic law in terms of categorizing particular practices. But his argument was that although it is simply permissible according to Islamic law, because this practice is a marker of Muslim distinction in the specific context of India, in this context, this in fact is an obligation. Why? Because if Muslims are pressured or coerced into abandoning a practice which is a marker of their distinction in the public sphere, that kind of coercion, that kind of pressure would go against the underlying purpose of the Sharia, which is to establish the exaltedness of Islam and of Muslims. So that's one very illustrative example in terms of a practice of everyday life that becomes especially punctuated during the festival of Eid, becoming the grounds and arenas for two competing visions of Muslim sovereign power. That, notice in this example that I've just very briefly described, um, for both of these groups of scholars, there are notions of sovereign power at work. For the Khilafat movement leaders, in the absence of a Muslim state in India, it really is the caliphate, the Ottoman caliphate, that is the primary sort of pivot of Muslim political life, of Muslim sovereign power, the caliphate. Whereas for someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, it's not so much the caliphate, which he did not even recognize as legitimate because it lacked the lineage of Prophet Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, but sovereign power resided in everyday ritual practices like cow sacrifice, like cow slaughter, which were markers of Muslim distinction. And if these markers of Muslim distinction were erased from the public sphere, that would lead to the evisceration of the political agency and the sovereign power of the Muslim community. So again, to bring this whole thing together, what we see here is that in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, this intra-Muslim debate on a matter of ethical significance becomes the arena, becomes the grounds for competing understandings of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty.
Which also brings me to the question, while we are talking of illustrative examples, is the issue around Babri Masjid, or say the issue around triple talaq, or issues that will basically concern everyday Muslim lives of India today. Where much of the conversations where I have with people, or earlier used to have with people, would be like, well, it's just one mosque where people don't used to pray, or well, there are multiple mosques where there are no people filling in the mosques for prayers. They lie empty. They're what are called Viran Masjid, um, and these suddenly, in the wake of attack, become spaces of contestation where they want to talk about how this is a significant um, a moment for them to defend. If you do not defend this,
Yeah.
then that
Yeah.
it all leads to a domino effect of submissiveness.
Right.
Which brings
Right.
me to a rather tangential but probably relevant question: is has this conception always been a part of uh, Muslim scholarly discourse, even other than South Asia, where they have actively kept demarcation in their everyday ritual practice to say that we are different from you, and thereby we, to keep their political sovereignty?
That's actually a very good question. And that question allows me to talk about another major theme of the book, another major question and answer space of the book, which is that the Islamic legal tradition in the pre-modern period, of course, is very diverse, and it takes on different kinds of forms and discourses and debates and varied contexts. But one thing that one can sort of not generalize about, but sort of posit nonetheless, is that uh, the Islamic legal tradition, which especially develops in the Abbasid period and moving onwards, was informed by a context of Muslim imperial sovereignty, of Muslim political sovereignty. In other words, the jurists who talked about things like Muslim non-Muslim relations, the categories that we must apply to different kinds of non-Muslims in a Muslim polity, or what should Muslims do if they get conquered by a non-Muslim entity, all these kinds of discussions and questions, even when different Muslim jurists might have articulated different views or varied views or competing views on these questions. Nonetheless, those views were informed by a background picture, by a background assumption of either the existence of Muslim imperial sovereignty or the desirability of Muslim imperial sovereignty. So, to answer your question more directly, yes, of course, there are precedents of this whole question of trying to maintain Muslim distinction over the non-Muslim other as a way of maintaining theological and political superiority over the non-Muslim other. So the famous sort of saying that Islam is exalted and nothing is exalted over it, or for example, the whole practice of establishing very close to the idea of markers of Muslim distinction, what is called ghiyar, or those kinds of external kind of markers like the wearing of a belt or other kinds of markers that would distinguish Muslims and non-Muslims in the public sphere. If you look at, I mean, my introduction, in fact, is less on South Asia and more on the pre-modern Muslim intellectual context with Arabic texts on this question, etc. So if you look at someone like Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah's famous text, Ahkam Ahl al-Dhimma, normative rulings on non-Muslims under Muslim rule, it's a legal compendium with very, very meticulous outline of the spatiality of a Muslim town in terms of burial sites and places of work and worship, a very kind of eagerly mapped out a map of Muslim distinction. And of course, that gets articulated in even more emphatic terms by someone like Ibn Taymiyyah in his texts, especially Iqtada as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, which is a famous sort of text of his on this question of Muslim non-Muslim relations. So yes, there are precedents. Yeah, now we can also read the pre-modern past in other ways. So, for example, in one of the chapters of my book, in chapter 5, which is on this whole idea of the reprehensible imitation of non-Muslims, which what is called tashabbuh in Islam, someone like uh, 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 someone like Shibli Nomani, in fact, uses the same kind of pre-modern tradition to talk about all the varied innovations that we had. So, for example, he gives the argument that the second caliph in Sunni Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab, to whom many people like Ibn Taymiyyah, like later sort of scholars even in South Asia, attribute the fact that he established Muslim non-Muslim distinctions and maintained this hierarchy. They also attribute to him this very important text in this regard called the Pact of Omar, Shurut Omar, uh, which historians have showed actually is not does not go back to the time of Omar, the second caliph, but the later, the Omar II, much later. But in the Muslim tradition, many do attribute it to even the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, where he laid out these kinds of distinctions that have to be maintained in everyday life. But Shibli Nomani uses the same Umar, the same caliph in his time period to argue that he was very open to ideas and innovations from non-Muslim communities. So he says that Omar in fact maintained structures of political administration that we might have seen in Byzantine areas that were conquered, or in Persian areas that came under Muslim rule, that he basically borrowed from the models of kingship from Zoroastrians, from the Byzantines, and so on, the Romans. So Shibli Nomani says that if Omar did not have a problem with that kind of borrowing, then why are we making such a big fuss about the whole question of imitating the non-Muslim other? And his emphasis there was not so much on Hindus and Muslims, but rather on the hesitance that he saw on the part of Muslim religious scholars, his own colleagues, in terms of adopting, colonial technologies, innovations, and so on. So the point being that the same pre-modern past can be interpreted and can be mobilized in very different ways by later thinkers in terms of what they want to do with that past to drive their ideological sort of agendas forward. But the last thing I would say in response to your question, it's a crucial kind of theme of the book as well, and the key question of the book as well, which is that, as I said, the Muslim normative, the Muslim legal tradition, um, and of course, law is not the only tradition in Islam. There are multiple other discursive traditions as well, but this is a very important and critical tradition nonetheless. On the question of Muslim non-Muslim relations, was informed by a context of Muslim political sovereignty, Muslim imperial sovereignty. So the whole question of the admissibility, the admissibility of testimony by non-Muslims, and all kinds of other questions of warfare and so on, was informed by this context of Muslim empire. So one of the main questions of my book is that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in a place like South Asia, with the fall of the Mughal Empire and the absence of the very possibility of a structure or an institution called the Muslim Empire, how do these South Asian Muslim scholars, in a context of colonization, in the context of becoming a colonized minority, draw on and refer back to a normative tradition of law when the very political context that had informed that normative tradition is no longer there? And that's basically what I mean in the book by after empire. That's basically the idea of debating Hindu-Muslim friendship after empire, that now that the very political context that had informed that normative tradition on the question of Muslim non-Muslim relations was no longer there, how did they then refer to and draw on that very tradition? So that's one key aspect of the book. And the other key aspect I'm interested in exploring in this book is, then how did these South Asian Muslim scholars um, forge the encounter between this pre-modern Islamic legal tradition and heritage and its categories, like Darul Islam, Darul Harb, Dhimmi, or a protected non-Muslim under Muslim rule, all these categories that are informed by a particular context of Muslim imperial sovereignty. So how did they forge an encounter between this legacy of pre-modern Islamic law with the emerging categories, expectations, and conditions of colonial modernity? and new categories like religious freedom or the secular and so on and so forth. So that encounter between the colonial discursive economy and the discourses and the heritage of the Islamic legal tradition, whose political context was no longer operative. And I mean, one of my main arguments is that this encounter is a site of tremendous intellectual creativity, intellectual fermentation, and friction in terms of how the question of Hindu-Muslim friendship was debated by South Asian ulama of different ideological persuasions.
Hmm. Okay, so again, I think I'm probably going to go into another tangent, but what I wanted to ask is about this is slightly more historical question is that the Islamic political sovereignty in South Asia probably in early modernity did not exist in one particular dynasty or an empire where like Mughal empire was separated and then there were a whole bunch of different empires and Muslim empires, Muslim sultanates in the south, and so on and so forth. So what I wanted to ask is, were these conversations also happening when were these discussions among scholars also happening when the Muslim political authority was being won and lost in certain regions of India? For example, I'm talking about Bahmani sultanates or the sultanates of the Nawabs of Bengal or Nawabs of Oudh. In general, Muslim political sovereignty didn't. Okay, I think what I'm trying to point is that it did not just vanish in one particular moment. It did not just vanish after one particular event, but it was a diminishing over a period of time. So, were these conversations also evolving over a period of time? What role did that have to play, or
Sure.
was there any?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. So, in answering the question again, I'll say a couple of things that would clarify further the argument that I make in this book. The one sort of clarifying comment I would make is that the question of Muslim empire actually operates in two connected but different ways in this book. One is, and actually the primary sort of way in which I am thinking about this idea of Muslim empire is the kind of imperial uh, 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 political conditions that informed the emergence and the discourses and discussions on the Islamic in the Islamic legal tradition on questions of Muslim non-Muslim relations, which of course has a certain kind of a context of the Abbasid Empire and so on, which becomes one of the major sort of political contexts informing the question of Muslim non-Muslim relations in Hanafi law, which is predominant in South Asia. And then the other kind of vector through which I'm approaching this category of Muslim empire is, of course, the Mughal Empire, and even the possibility of some kind of an institution or structure that can be associated with the idea of Muslim imperial sovereignty. So, my text is primarily located in Delhi and northern India. So that particular context of South Asian history, and it, my argument is not so much of a causative historicist argument that Muslim political sovereignty declines and then new thoughts emerge, but it's to do with the very conceptual status of discourses on interreligious friendship. What happens to the very sort of character and the conceptual status of those discourses when the political context that had informed those discourses, even beyond South Asia for that matter, as I've been talking about in the Abbasid Empire and so on, where the very possibility that a Muslim state would have any kind of recourse to or interest in maintaining those forms of life that are articulated and that are argued for in that sort of discursive universe of Islamic law was no longer available. So this narrative might have taken a very different shape if it was happening elsewhere in South Asia. So I have to sort of emphasize my focus is on northern India, Delhi. These scholars associated with particular groups that emerged in northern India and in Delhi, who are among the most influential sort of groups of Muslim scholars. And this might have taken a very different kind of a texture if we talk about a different context. So it's a very context-specific argument that I'm making in relation to this point. And again, with the idea of Muslim empire, I'm not so much suggesting a historically kind of positive argument about some kind of a historicist uh, 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 mapping between fall of political power and new forms of theological discourses, but rather it's a more kind of a subtle process of reckoning with a tradition whose political context of empire and imperial sovereignty is no longer there. So that's what I would say in response to your question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I was just really trying to push in to see if it actually gives more context to the contestations that are happening within when you say intra-Muslim debates about what imperial political theology is. I just wanted to try and see if there was any relation with changing access to sovereignty. Was it having any implication on the debate? But yeah, that makes sense. As you explained, it's a more conceptual argument as opposed to a historicist argument. Srushti, do you have any questions before we can move on to talking about intra-Muslim debates over Hindu-Muslim friendship?
Yeah, actually, I just quickly wanted to ask about the decline of the Mughal Empire. So, there is a certain political context in which conceptions of imperial Muslim sovereignty develop, as you talked about. Now, I just wanted to understand that the way in, the reception part of it, like the way it was received by the normative arguments were received by people, in their everyday lives. Did they look back at the political context with nostalgia? Or to back a time that when the political context supported the conceptual ideas, or did they look back at it with something like rage that we want to reclaim that space again that was there in a certain specific political context?
That's a good question. Um, I think not so much nostalgia for a particular kind of political order, but rather what we find in many of these discourses of South Asian Muslim scholars from different ideological persuasions is a certain discourse of what I might call mourning the loss of sovereign power. And that loss of sovereign power and that kind of discourse of mourning is not always presented in the form of the loss of the political state, which is an interesting idea. Let me elaborate here. There are multiple examples of very authoritative South Asian Muslim scholars. For example, let's take the example of someone like the scholar called Shah Abdul Aziz, died, I think, 1824. The eldest son of the famous scholar, 18th century scholar Shah Waliullah, who died in 1762. So Shah Abdul Aziz in the early 19th century, in 1803, gives this famous legal opinion in Persian, or fatwa, in which he declared India Darul Harb, or a society which has come under non-Muslim rule. Um, but interestingly, when you look at that fatwa, that legal opinion, what he's primarily disturbed by is not so much the loss of a Muslim state, but rather the difficulty of establishing and maintaining precisely rituals like Eid, rituals that have to do with, the congregational prayers, the maintenance of Muslim courts, and so on, through which Muslim moral life can be maintained. And that fatwa is not so much a commentary on a nostalgia for a Muslim political state, but rather precisely for the difficulty of maintaining and establishing Muslim ritual life in these new conditions. Another example, not covered in this book, but my previous book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, is of course of the scholars Shah Muhammad Ismail, who in fact was a grandson of Shah Waliullah. Shah Muhammad Ismail died 1831. And the millenarian and very charismatic scholar called Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, not to be confused with Ahmad Raza Khan, who also was a close associate of Shah Muhammad Ismail, died 1831 as well. So in their discourses, you again see the idea that they associate a corrupt political order, or a political order which is sort of engulfed with moral chaos and corruption, not so much with the absence of Muslim political state, but rather the absence of these distinctive markers of Islam. And they go on so far as to say, and they're today remembered as these very harsh or Puritan kinds of Muslim scholars. But if you look at, for example, this incredible Persian text of Shah Muhammad Ismail called The Station of Leadership, Mansab-e-Imama, that I devoted an entire chapter to in my first book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity. I think it was chapter 4. He basically makes the argument that even the most corrupt of political rulers will be totally fine as long as people should give the ruler some advice to correct his course and so on. But as long as the markers of Muslim distinction remain current, remain present in the public sphere, even the most corrupt or morally debased of political rulers will be acceptable. So clearly, this kind of a focus on these markers of Muslim distinction as the underlying site of Muslim identity and sovereign power is something that we see increasingly punctuated from the early 19th century onwards, and takes on an even more emphasis by the late 19th century. So clearly, this happening in this particular time period has to do something with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and how it makes possible a notion of sovereign power that in fact is much more expansive and non-territorial. So my main conceptual interest in this book as well is to think about how the very sphere and how the very domain of politics and sovereignty takes on a different kind of expansiveness, takes on a different kind of character that is no longer bound to the territoriality of this modern state as being the major sort of marker or theater of what sovereignty represents.
I think the next section that we wanted to touch upon is the discourse. What was the discourse like? You mentioned that this discourse was not necessarily binary; it was not necessarily categorical, as you mentioned earlier. So, what were these some of these complex exchanges or rival visions, especially in terms of Hindu-Muslim relationship that was being discussed? If you could give us some illustrations as well.
Sure, definitely. Let me give an illustration of the very first chapter of the book, which focuses on Indian Muslim translations of Hindu thought and practice. And it's a chapter that gives both a sort of a survey of prominent Indian Muslim scholarly examinations and translations of Hindu thought and practice, and then from the 11th to the 18th centuries. And then it intensively focuses on one prominent and illustrative example of this in the 18th century by this Delhi-based Sufi scholar Mirza Mazhar Janan, who died in 1781 and lived from 1699 to 1781. And a famous Sufi master from the Naqshbandi Sufi order, a contemporary of Shah Waliullah. So he has this very interesting and fascinating treatise in the form of a letter that he wrote for his disciples on how one should understand Hindu thought and practice. And in this kind of a translation enterprise, and the main sort of way in which this chapter connects to the theme of friendship is that it takes the cue of the French thinker Jacques Derrida, who said that translation is the condition of all hospitality. So translation being an arena, being a site for the articulation of a vision of friendship with the other, how translating the other becomes an arena for presenting the limits of friendship with the other. So in this treatise, Mirza Mazhar Janan gives a very sympathetic and even a very admiring evaluation of Hindu philosophical thought and discourses, where on these very contentious questions of were prophets ever sent to India. He argues that there are Quranic verses where some of the messengers that God had sent in different places have not been mentioned. So some messengers have gone unmentioned in the Quran, and they may well have been sent to India. So there is definitely that possibility. On the question of idol worship, he says that the practice of idol worship among the Hindus cannot be compared with the idol worship of pre-Islamic pagans who used to consider their idols as effective and agentive in of themselves, which is not the case with the Hindus of India, who just consider this to be a prostration of reverence when they prostrate before idols and so on, and not a prostration of worship. On the question of transmigration, of transference of one soul to another, which is one of the most thorny theological issues in relation to Hindu-Muslim relations, he basically argues that it is not necessary for you to charge someone with unbelief who has a belief in transmigration. And he adds another interesting caveat to that you could that is possible, but it is not necessary. So it sort of leaves open that kind of possibility and ambiguity. And then he makes these series of equivalences between what he calls Islamic and Hindu law and theology. So for him, the discourses and the traditions of Hindu intellectual traditions were completely coherent, were completely logical. And he says that what the Hindus call Dharma Shastra is basically what we call ilmul fiqh, knowledge of jurisprudence, and what they call Karma Shastra is basically what we call dialectical theology or ilmul kalam. And then explains the caste system, drawing on laws of Manu. So he has a very admiring and evaluation of Hindu thought and practice, but at the same time, there are two caveats to that he also inserts. One is that he makes a distinction between those Hindus who came before the coming of Islam and those who came after the coming of Islam. And he makes it very clear that his admiring and positive evaluation is only applicable to those who came before the coming of Islam. So the 7th century and the coming of Islam becomes the key temporal demarcator, the key temporal line separating belief and heresy, separating the self and the other. So with this kind of a move, he's able to present a very sympathetic, even admiring account of Hindu thought and practice, while also maintaining his fidelity to a view of Islam as exceptional. The exceptionalism of Islam is also, something that he keeps and abides with. So, in terms of theorizing this kind of a translation project, it might be gainful for us and useful for us to talk about the sort of contradictions in the very idea of friendship and hospitality that were talked about by Jacques Derrida, where he says that when the host, gives asylum or greets the guest to his or her home, the terms of that relationship, the terms of the friendship, are nonetheless set by the host in terms of the patron and the host. The hierarchy is still maintained. So here we see, and that for Derrida was one of the major contradictions of the ideas of hospitality and friendship. So we see that contradiction also at work in someone like Mirza Madhar Jane Janan, who, while being very sympathetic and even admiring, nonetheless maintains his fidelity with Islamic exceptionalism. So my main point in that analysis, and there is the data, of course, in the chapter that I can't rehearse here, the details in the data, but my main point through this analysis was that we cannot approach someone like Jane Janan through the binary prism of inclusive or exclusive, or someone who is tolerant or intolerant. The other sort of modification in his view that is important to again puncture this kind of a liberal binaries of approaching Muslim scholars is that Jane Janan made a clear distinction between the Hindu scholastic traditions, the intellectual traditions, and then the participation of Muslims, especially of women, in Hindu rituals and devotional practices like Diwali and Holi. And he was extremely critical in a language which was much more acerbic about the importance of keeping Muslims, especially women, away from these Hindu rituals, lest their identity become, mixed with that of the other. So in that same thinker, we see all these different kinds of tendencies. When Mirza Madhar Jane Janan was assassinated, according to the hagiography, by some Shias who were deeply offended by a comment that Mirza Madhar Jane Janan had made when a procession during Muharram had passed through his house, and Mirza Madhar had called that procession a heretical innovation. So a few days later, he heard a knock on his door, and when he opened it, people from the Shia community, according to hagiographies attached to him, shot him, and then he died a few days later. So when he died, he was offered treatment by a British physician in Delhi, but he said, "I would rather die than be treated by an infidel." So the same Mirza Madhar Jane Janan, who is very capacious, very sort of expansive in his understanding of the Hindu other, intellectually, scholastically, is the same Mirza Madhar Jane Janan who gets killed by Shia, same Mirza Madhar Jane Janan who refuses treatment by British quote-unquote infidel, same Mirza Madhar Jane Janan who is deeply perturbed by the idea of Indian Muslim women participating in Diwali and Holi. So he's a very complex character, and he cannot fit into these kind of contemporary grids that we have of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, or the inclusivist and the exclusivist. And my main argument in this book is that if you really want to, be sympathetic and respectful of Islam in South Asia, you have to address and you have to listen to these logics that are not amenable to the tolerant or the most inclusive brands of Indian Muslims that we might, want to present in the public sphere today. That you have to consider the complexities and those, uncomfortable dimensions of their thought as well that don't align nicely with contemporary notions of niceness, so to say. I can't hear you.
I muted myself. Yeah, no, I think the next question that I had was about how were these intra-Muslim tensions, uh, about what Hindu-Muslim relationship should be like. What was this revealing about their conversations about Islam in itself? Like, were they contesting, where and how were they contesting, or their conception of Islam differed while trying to understand what the relationship should be like between
Yeah.
Muslims and Hindus. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the major themes of this book, of how this question of Hindu-Muslim friendship becomes one of the major arenas where you have the articulation of competing visions of Islam as well. And more specifically, I'm interested in this book, and a major focus of this book is on uh, ways in which this problem of the limits of Hindu-Muslim friendship becomes the grounds for especially major fault lines and divisions between Muslim traditionalism or the worldview of the ulama, singular alim, and Muslim modernists of different varieties like Abul Kalam Azad or Sayyid Ahmad Khan and so on. So let me give you yet another example. The last chapter of the book is called the Aligarh-Deoband divide, competing rationalities of reform, of Muslim reform in South Asia, or something along the lines. Yeah, the Aligarh-Deoband divide, competing rationalities of reform in Muslim South Asia. So, uh, so here I'm looking at the very debate on reprehensible imitation of on Muslims, what is called tashabbuh, which is a category in Muslim thought which comes from a hadith or the saying of the Prophet, which says that whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. So how that becomes a major point of contestation between competing groups of Muslim scholars. So someone like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the founder of the Aligarh, Muslim University, in his famous journal Tahzib al-Akhlaq, spent quite a bit of time talking about this idea, in which he dismissed the authenticity of this hadith and said its chain of transmissions are not authentic or not valid. And the other thing that he says is that the meaning of this hadith is completely unclear, or the application of this hadith is completely unclear. And in making that argument, he basically says that, so what if you imitate the other? And he says things like, the Prophet himself, for example, used to wear cloaks made by the Roman Christians or other garments made by the Jews, of Yemen and so on. So if he did not have a problem with wearing the clothes of the non-Muslim communities, then why are South Asian Muslim scholars becoming so uptight about the idea of wearing a dhoti or wearing an English hat or those kinds of questions? So he basically, dismissed this anxiety or this preoccupation with the idea of maintaining distinction from the non-Muslim other, um, among other things in his texts. And the main response to that was composed by a scholar called Maulana Qari Tayyib, who, of course, is the grandson of the founder of the Deoband Madrasa, Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, died 1877. So his grandson is someone called Maulana Qari Tayyib, who was the principal, the Muhtamim of Deoband for many decades. So in his youth, when he was around 32 years of age, he wrote what is perhaps the most extensive text on this topic of tashabbuh, imitation of non-Muslims, called At-Tashabbuh fil Islam, or Tashabbuh in Islam. So coming back to Qari Tayyib's text, Reprehensible Imitation in Islam, or Tashabbuh fil Islam, uh, the main argument that he makes is that it's really distinction that makes possible the preservation of Muslim identity. And one of the major threats to the integrity of identity and even the possibility and existence of identity, both at the level of the individual and the level of the community, is precisely mixture with the other, is precisely the obfuscation of one's own identity when it imitates the other, what he called ikhtilat and iltibas, basically, both meaning some questions of the ideas of mixing or the obfuscation of one's own identity. Yeah, basically for Qari Tayyib, when he critiqued and responded to Sayyid Ahmad Khan, uh, I mean, his main argument was that this, in fact, is a very consequential issue. It cannot be dismissed so easily. And its purpose is the maintenance of Muslim distinction, which is the main factor on which the identity of the Muslim self, both individually and also communally, rests. And on this particular question of that Sayyid Ahmad Khan had said that even the Prophet used to wear, cloaks or robes made by Roman Christians and so on. He makes a very interesting argument there, Qari Tayyib, where he says that uh, that kind of manufacturing was just a functional association with those communities. That it was basically those communities that used to manufacture those items, like the cloaks or the shawls or whatever it might have been. So the Prophet wearing them was not a marker of, did not index the Prophet imitating those communities, because they basically were the producers, the manufacturers of those items. So there was nothing normatively consequential about wearing those items. So the example that he gives closer to South Asia is, for example, what he says, Pear's soap is a soap which is manufactured by the British. So South Asians using it is not a normative imitation, but rather just a functional kind of reason for that consumption, for that use. And one of the most interesting arguments on this question of tashabbuh was made by another Deoband scholar called Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, the other major founder of Deoband, died 1906, in which he curiously made the argument on the question of the British hat, that a South Asian Muslim, if he or she wears the hat in India itself, that would be normatively prohibited. That would come under the ambit of a reprehensible imitation. But the same hat worn in the UK would not be reprehensible, because in the UK everyone wears those hats. So it's not distinctive. It's not a distinctive marker of a non-Muslim community, whereas it is the case within South Asia. Um, so at stake in this whole issue was precisely the exhibition of identity through the body and its status in the context of Indian Muslims becoming colonized. And for someone like Qari Tayyib and also for Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, maintaining the integrity of Indian Muslim community was contingent on maintaining the distinction of a Indian Muslim self. And it's a very philosophically interesting argument, because basically what it argues is that every category of life, whether you have a lion or a human or whatever category it might be, comes in particular forms. So every kind of ontological entity, human, animal, a table, whatever it might be, a snake, comes in a particular ontological form. And if that external ontological form is transformed, if it is mixed with something else, if it is made into something else, then the integrity of that identity or that entity that form represents would also become completely wrecked. So that basically was their main kind of philosophical argument about the relationship between ontology and form. And that was their main critique of someone like Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Sort of to complete this answer, Qari Tayyib sarcastically mentioned in his text that when someone enters into a party with an a fez hat and then a English suit, etc., that is basically exhibiting a confused identity. It's what he says is, it's like someone who is a man but wears a woman's dress coming into a gathering. Everyone would ogle at that person. Everyone might embarrass that person. So clearly, when he talked about the fez hat and the and British attire together, he was referring to that very iconic image of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, uh, which to his admirers was an index of, which was a proof of his adaptability, his flexibility, his ability to bring together Western and Eastern, ontologies or forms of being. But what to his admirers of Sayyid Ahmad Khan was his flexibility, or of his inter-civilizational kind of capacity to keep the East and the West together, was to someone like Qari Tayyib the complete obfuscation, the complete erasure and confusion of the self. So this is a very interesting kind of, to come back to your main question, that notice that this whole debate over imitating the non-Muslim other is becoming the grounds for competing articulations of what gets counted as Islam and competing visions of how we imagine the relationship between, for example, being and form, how we imagine the relationship between, Muslim encounters and interactions with non-Muslim forms of life and knowledge. In other words, becomes the ground for the divisions between what later on comes to be known as Muslim traditionalism and Muslim modernism. So I'm really interested in how this particular question becomes the grounds for these much larger fault lines and divisions among South Asian Muslims, especially among the traditionalists and the modernists.
Oh, it's a very interesting divide. Srushti, did you have any questions before we could move on about relevance of these debates and facing these debates in today's South Asia? So, yeah, no, okay. So yeah, I think we wanted to move on to the next section, or the last segment, which is to talk about the implications of these debates, and also maybe if it is under the purview of your book, or even if not, or if you could just give us a comment on how these debates continue in today's South Asia in different contexts of both maybe India and Pakistan.
I'm sure I can actually give you the example of or the illustration example with which I close the book in the epilogue, which is of a figure like Sharjeel Imam, who is of course a very important figure today, still imprisoned since 2020. And the epilogue basically engages with the speeches that he gave, because of which he was then charged with sedition and imprisoned. And in one of the speeches, he basically makes mention of one of the main texts that I look at in chapter 4 of the book, which is on this whole question of cow sacrifice that I talked about a bit earlier as well, where you have the founder of the Barelvi school, Ahmad Raza Khan, who talked about how cow sacrifice, remember, is a marker of Muslim distinction and hence cannot be abandoned by Indian Muslims out of the pressure or coercion of the Hindu community. So Sharjeel Imam talks about exactly that text and says that, why is it that in curricula, in public discussions and discourses, in the kind of intellectual and popular kind of imaginaries and discourses, we are not really taught, and we are not really exposed to this particular viewpoint, but the viewpoint of his main rival, Abul Kalam Azad, who basically aligned with Gandhi in the Indian National Congress, and talked about ways in which Indian Muslims can seize cow sacrifice as a way to respect the religious sensitivities of the Hindu community. So Sharjeel Imam makes two very provocative claims or points in that speech, where on the one hand he says that it was precisely this argument by Abul Kalam Azad that he says he might have had his good reasons. Abul Kalam Azad may have been well-intentioned, may have had good reasons for it, but he says that kind of seeding the ground or on this question of cow sacrifice is precisely what opened the avenues, is precisely what opened the path for the contemporary Hindu nationalist movement of cow protection and the kind of violence and the kind of horrific kind of lynchings that have been done in India and so on. So it's a very interesting kind of argument where he in fact locates the beginnings of Hindu nationalism, not so much in people like Savarkar and so on. He would not disagree with that, but this whole Khilafat movement moment in 1920, 21, and in this alliance between the Khilafat movement leaders and Gandhi, he saw the opening of the avenue through which Indian Muslims can be, put on the defensive on this question of cow slaughter, cow sacrifice, and so on. So that was one of the arguments that he made. And the other argument he made was, why are we not taught the other perspective in our histories, in our lessons, in our curricula, and so on? So he makes this very iconic statement in that speech that our history has not been written. He says it will take at least 50 years to write our history. Now, I of course don't share the normative position of someone like Sharjeel Imam, and my job as an a student of religion is to reflect sympathetically but critically with these kinds of discourses. But one doesn't have to be in complete agreement with Sharjeel Imam to not appreciate the significance and importance of both the contemporary valences, the contemporary lives of these debates that happened exactly a century ago in this case of cow sacrifice. This debate was happening exactly in 1920. So a century later, in 2020, when someone like Sharjeel Imam gives that speech, we are really talking about the afterlives of that colonial moment. Where interestingly, if you look at 1920, it's a moment which is sandwiched between 1857 and 1947. So sandwiched between the trauma of the 1857 rebellion and then the violence of the partition of South Asia. So it's somewhere in between where you have an Indian Muslim community and intelligentsia and Muslim scholars who are still grappling with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and power, but yet the way in which they're engaging in their discourses cannot be mapped onto post-colonial nation states. So it's kind of at this in-between moment of 1920. But how that becomes significant and critical for a contemporary actor like Sharjeel Imam is, I think, quite fascinating. This, whether we agree with him or we don't. And the last point I would make on Sharjeel Imam and this question is that even if we might not fully agree with him, I think he is onto something about the whole question of why in Western contexts and even in South Asian contexts we are so oftentimes um, uh, um, invested in finding what one might call the good Muslims from history. I mean, even someone like Abul Kalam Azad is much more complicated than some kind of a inclusivist or a good liberal Muslim, because this was the scholar who, in fact, said that waging jihad and waging a war against the British state was an individual obligation on every Indian Muslim. So, the seeming modernist or inclusivist is the one calling for jihad against the British as an individual obligation, and in very strongly Islamic theological terms. The text that I look of him in chapter 3 is a deep reading in Islamic theology and its other normative sources of authority and so on. A text called Jaziratul Arab, the Arabian Peninsula, on the whole idea of the caliphate and why Indian Muslims must defend it. But coming back to Sharjeel Imam, so one of the main points that I want to make in this book, as well as connecting it to the contemporary context, especially of contemporary India, is that if you really want to be serious about combating Islamophobia, if you really want to be serious about combating anti-Muslim racism that we've seen the spike of, especially in the last decade or so in India, we need to listen sympathetically to Muslim voices that don't align with the contemporary notion of what counts as the tolerant, the pluralist, the inclusive Muslim. And we have to listen sympathetically and carefully without endorsing necessarily the voices of people like Sharjeel Imam, people like Ahmad Raza Khan, who do not align so clearly and nicely with kind of contemporary templates of what gets counted as the inclusivist, the pluralist, the moderate, and so on. And to look at the tensions, ambiguities, and the contradictions, but also the depth and sophistication of these thinkers and voices. And examples of that I've given constantly in the book, that people like Ahmad Raza Khan were not some kind of unhinged exclusivists who were completely dislodged from the context or the limitations of their time. So to just give you one example, Ahmad Raza Khan, the same scholar who wrote this entire long text on why Indian Muslims should not abandon cow sacrifice, he also argues that in places where the British have banned cow sacrifice, they should do so, and they should abide by the law. And he makes the argument that if Muslims get arrested, that will lead to the diminishing of Muslim power, diminishing of Muslim reputation in India, which is not an outcome which can be desired by the Sharia. The same Ahmad Raza Khan, in fact, argues that if the British compel Indian Muslims to cease cow sacrifice, that would go against the very promise of religious freedom, which is promised by British liberalism, this idea of religious freedom and not encroaching on or not intervening in matters of religion of a particular community. So that same Ahmad Raza Khan, who at one point can be seen as a very exclusivist subject, at another point can be, very pragmatic about his categories, about his arguments. He even argued that when it comes to friendship with a non-Muslim other in the context of the Khilafat movement, So someone asked him then, what kind of an attitude should we have to the British? They're also non-Muslims. So he makes this very interesting kind of distinction between what he calls substantive friendship uh, and what he calls mere transactional relations. So he basically says that we have to maintain mere transactional relations by taking funding from the British for Muslim schools and other projects, but that does not equate to substantive friendship. So the point I'm getting at is that these thinkers, whom we, when we look back at them, we might say, oh, they're exclusivists, oh, they are not into Hindu-Muslim friendship, and just dismiss them or cast them as deeply problematic or uh, you know uh, 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 unamenable to the whole project of establishing interreligious relations and friendship. We would be doing a disservice to the enterprise of intellectual inquiry if we did not listen to these voices according to their own terms, according to their own logics. I'm not saying one endorses them or one sort of romanticizes them, but one has to reckon with and one has to develop some kind of literacy about the logics of their thought and life, which are a lot more sophisticated and nuanced than these kinds of categories like exclusivist, inclusivist, and so on. With both someone like Abul Kalam Azad or someone like Ahmad Raza Khan.
And I think you've beautifully just concluded. I think I was going to ask the conclusion, being like, okay, what is your takeaway from the conversation? And if you've already articulated that. So I think these were the questions I had generally about your book and your study. But other than that, Srushti, do you have any questions?
I do, but I'm now skeptical because he's ended it on such a high note, and the question will go back again to something that we have deeply discussed. But I'll still go on. I actually wanted to understand, like, coming back to the fundamentals, that like the centrality question of it, like when we talk about the sovereignty or the distinction, basically, how central was it to the life of an average Muslim residing at the onset of colonial modernity? Did they have other identities, class identities, caste identities, gender identities? If they did, then how did they coexist?
That's a great question, and certainly they did. And not only the, what you're calling average Muslim on the ground, but even these Muslim scholars, their discourses, their identities, and their sort of social imaginaries were strongly calibrated by, considerations for class and caste. As I show in my first book, in fact, one of the categories that we see Muslim scholars or the ulama from all kinds of ideological backgrounds, whether they're Deobandis or Barelvis or whichever they might be, the repetitive use of the category of chamar or the low caste leather worker is so prevalent and predominant in these Muslim reformist discourses that it's quite incredible. When it comes to Maulana Qasim Nanotwi, the founder of Deoband, one of the most famous stories associated with him in his hagiographies is that one day he was traveling on the train, and Qasim Nanotwi is presented as a very ascetic figure, a very reclusive figure who shunned worldly pleasures and good clothes and so on. So he was wearing clothes which were so tattered and completely, he seemed so unkempt that someone confused him for a julaha or a weaver. And someone asked, from the julaha community, how much is yarn selling for today in the market? And Qasim Nanotwi does not correct him and says, brother, I have not had a chance to go to the market. I'm hearing my own voice. I'm hearing my own voice. Which is fine, but let me know if I should continue or.
No, I think it's fine. Okay, yeah, that's fine now while you're on mute, but
yeah. So that narrative, which is a very sort of common narrative of his hagiography, shows that on the one hand, look at the tension and the paradox of the narrative. That on the one hand, it's trying to present Qasim Nanotwi as someone who does not really care about, social hierarchies or clothing and these kind of external markers of, affluence and so on. But yet the narrative is deeply class and caste based. It is premised on the figure of the Julaha. So certainly this whole pastoral anxiety about regulating everyday Muslim life so that it does not become infected by the contagion of the other is an elite anxiety. And it is being lodged in a particular moment where the logics of everyday life on the ground do not always correspond with idealized logics of Muslim normative, texts and practice. And it's precisely the fissures between the logics of everyday existence, which are not, governed by these kinds of generalized distinctions of the Hindu, the Muslim, but you have these emerging notions of universal and more unified understandings of Islamic and Hindu identity. So it's this tussle between these kinds of official and normative conceptions of, more generalizable and universalized and monolithic notions of identity coming from, the textual and the intellectual narratives and discourses and traditions, and then the unfolding of everyday relations on the ground, which are a lot messier, which are a lot, less monolithic or generalized. So that tussle is precisely one of the things that I try to capture. But clearly, more work is needed from social history and other, kinds of histories of this period that would give us a better sense of how were these discourses and these categories being imagined by, quote unquote, everyday Muslims on the ground. My book, with my disciplinary training, is more focused on the intellectual traditions. But I hope that clears the way for, other historians to do that kind of work as well. Thank you so much, both of you. Terrific questions.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Dariyaa podcast. We hope you found our discussion thought-provoking. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us reach more listeners like you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep challenging the status quo. If you enjoy our podcast and want to support our mission, consider buying us a coffee. Help us by covering our running costs. Your contribution, no matter how small, help us continue produce high quality content and bring academic insights to a wider audience. Just head over to Buy Me a Coffee page and show us your support. Every little bit makes a difference and we truly appreciate your generosity. Link is in the podcast description. If you believe in our mission and want to be part of a community that values intellectual curiosity, cultural exploration, and meaningful dialogue with compassion, we invite you to join Ergo Collective. Follow us on social media, participate in our discussion forums, and consider supporting our work through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Together, we can make a difference and create a more informed, empathetic, and connected world.